Dear viewers and followers, this is Arnesa Bulushmich-Kustura, and today we'll be discussing the Bosnian ethnic cleansing campaign with Dr. Hikmet Karcic, a genocide scholar based in Sarajevo. This is part of Remembering Srebrenica's series of In Conversation With. Dr. Karcic, thank you so much for being here and agreeing to have this really important discussion with us.
Thanks for the invite.
So we're going to discuss several different topics today. Dr. Karcic defended his thesis at the International University of Sarajevo. His thesis was actually on the way detention camps were used as a tool of ethnic cleansing by Serb forces. So I sort of wanted to dwell into that topic first. However, we're also going to be discussing the massacres in Visegrad, particularly Pionirska and the Bikovac street fire, as the anniversary of those massacres is nearing. So as a way of remembering, we're going to be discussing the atrocities that occurred there as well. Dr. Karcic, I wanted to sort of ask you about just a sort of overall explanation. I know that your thesis is very detailed and obviously, but detention camps as a tool for ethno-religious cleansing of non-Serbs. Now, it's quite a well-known established fact that throughout the region of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were several different concentration camps, detention camps, most notably in northern Bosnia, in cases like Amarska, Trnopolje, Manjača. However, your thesis focused on the other regions as well. So I wanted to see if you could sort of talk us through that and give us a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, sure. So basically, concentration camps, detention centers, and basically detention facilities were opened up at the very start of the war by the Bosnian Serb forces. And basically what I wanted to show in my research was put those camps and those facilities, which were used by the Bosnian Serb government, into a wider context of concentration camp history. Mm-hmm. So since each concentration camp system in the world is alike, but it's unique. So I wanted to show what was it, why and in which way was the camp system in Bosnia unique in itself? Because obviously you cannot compare each and every camp system in the history of camps, but each camp system is very specific and unique for itself. So basically, what I did was I took the camps which were located in 4 cities, 4 towns as case studies. So I researched Prijedor, Bijeljina, Visegrad, and Bileća. And actually what I wanted to show was how were these camps used by the Bosnian Serb forces in the ethno-religious campaign of cleansing the population in the local areas, which made up a larger mosaic of genocide. And of course, here I focus on the period from 1992 to 1995. Some of these camps were reopened again in the later phase, and in some cases, you had camps which lasted the whole entire war. Most of the stories which we hear about the camps mainly focus on 1992, but little is it known that in some cases, after the camps were discovered in northwestern Bosnia, some of the inmates, some of the internees from these camps were moved and removed to other hidden smaller detention facilities throughout the Bosnian Serb Republic. And I came up with a new theory on camps, which was very specific for Bosnia itself. I call this the collective traumatization, because this is something which I claim that the Bosnian Serbs did not have the aim in camps to murder everybody in the camps, but rather the camps were a sort of filter being used in the local communities in order to get rid of most educated elites, most important people in the local communities, and then traumatize the rest of the people through the camp system to that extent that they would never return back to their hometowns. So if you get rid of basically the elites of one population, traumatize the rest through a series of different crimes, which I laid out in my thesis, which are, for example, rape, sexual abuse, executions, public executions, publicly, in a very brutal, sadistic way. And then in this way, you highly traumatize the population to that extent that they would never want to return back to Visegrad, to Foča, to Eastern Bosnia, to Northwestern Bosnia, and so on. And you have many of these cases where survivors of these camps who witnessed or who were exposed to sexual violence, rape, public executions, the destruction of religious buildings, the burning of their homes, and so on. Most of them returned back to their homes only to visit their family graves or to sell their houses and so on. Some of them, in some cases, have never returned back. They live in Australia, they live in Canada, they live far away, and mainly they would come back only in cases when some of their loved ones were identified from mass graves. So this whole context is very interesting because in this way, the whole entire population was totally erased from Eastern Bosnia, and specifically the Bosnian Serb forces. The ideology was to get rid of Bosniak Muslim population from the Drina Valley and from the Sana Valley, from the Sana River in northwestern Bosnia. So those were the two main areas that they really wanted to get rid of, because those were the areas where most of the Bosniak population was living in 1992. So by getting rid of these people in a series of smaller massacres, nothing large, Srebrenica was like the largest massacre. But through this series of smaller massacres, smaller executions, but very brutal, sadistic executions, in combination with this ethno-religious cleansing of brutal, sadistic torture, humiliation in camps, rape, sexual abuse, and so on. They were very, very successful in getting rid of the whole entire Bosniak Muslim population from these areas. And what I really found very interesting in these cases were these elements, these ways how you could connect certain Orthodox Christian anniversaries or public holidays and so on with mass atrocities. So, for example, Vidovdan, St. Vincent's Day, on that day, and on Petrovdan, St. Peter's Day, and so on, you had large massacres occurring in Omarska, in Visegrad, and so on and so forth. So that's why you have this ethno-religious element there. And also what I wanted to analyze was the rhetoric of the perpetrator. So if a perpetrator comes up, for example, in Visegrad and enters a concentration camp and takes out an old man, this case which really happened in Hassan Velat school. They took out an older man. It was dark at night. They opened up after screams. People heard screams. They opened up the doors, and a Bosnian soldier came inside and threw a cut-off head of the old man into the public, into the whole group of people who were there in the camp. So basically, what happened that night was there was one murder, one execution, but everybody in that room remembers that head flying over the whole room. And at that time, the Bosnian Serb soldiers said, "This is your kurban," because it was eat the next day. So this way of using this ethno-religious rhetoric was something which I found very, very fascinating, and this is something which I wanted to research in detail, and especially these public executions in which you commit in a public way, in which Foucault really in his book talked about public executions in more detail, what element they have whole prison camp system. In this way, by making public execution, public humiliation of people and so on, left a long-lasting transgenerational trauma on the Bosniaks of Eastern Bosnia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you mentioned, the collective traumatization really did lead to that ultimate goal of ethnic cleansing. I mean, it was quite successful when we take into consideration the fact that the vast majority of Bosniaks from that area have not been able to return. And if they do return, it's usually just to visit the graves or to visit certain family members that stayed behind. So in many ways, when we talk about the collective Bosnian genocide, I know a lot of people focus on Srebrenica, and obviously that is an ICTY case of genocide. However, when we talk about really the Bosnian genocide, we can say that it started in 1992. And what happened in Srebrenica in 1995 was really the culmination of the continuous genocidal ethnic cleansing process that had been going on already for 3-4 years now. So do you, when it comes to, in your sort of scholarly opinion, do you think that this collective traumatization, this sort of successful ethnic cleansing campaign that they had enacted, do you think that there's a way to heal from that? There's a way for the Bosniaks to return and reconcile with the past? Do you, or not even do you think if there's a way, do you think it's possible that's going to happen?
One of the key things which I did in my research was I wanted to look at who the perpetrators were, because usually the focus in genocide is on the victims. I wanted here to see who the perpetrators were, and according to my research, most of the camps, most of the perpetrators inside the camps were members of the reserve police force of the Bosnian Republic. So the reserve police force was mainly made up of local people from the local communities. And in most cases, you will see that, and I proved this in my research of several cases, that the perpetrators in most of the cases knew their victims.
Mm-hmm.
The victims knew them. In such cases, and especially in the case of Bosnia, where the perpetrators of the genocide were not militarily defeated, mm-hmm. whereas in the Second World War they were, and in the case in Rwanda as well. In Bosnian case, they weren't defeated, or rather these institutions and agencies which perpetrated genocide and ethnic cleansing and so on, not only are they do they still continue to function, but they have become part of the peace process. So the police of the Bosnian Republic, the Ministry of Justice, for example, and so on, they all became part of the Dayton Peace Accords. So if you want to return back to a small town in Eastern Bosnia, and you're there, and the local police, which is supposed to protect you from national, are in fact the people who kicked you out of your hometown 20 years ago. I don't see I didn't see a possibility for anybody feeling safe in 1998, 1999 to stay there for a long time. You had a case of very successful returnees coming back to Hazarac and to Bedor after the war. Mm-hmm. These are people who were resilient, who went back, who wanted to turn back and show that they survived. And after some time, they just, people started losing hope, and the number of returnees in these areas is being lowered through a series of different reasons, including the fact that people don't have jobs, don't have security, don't have justice in some cases. And these are the reasons why this returning process did not succeed. Quite today, you only have 5% of the population in Bosnia to be non-Serbs. So, in order to get back to the question on whether people can come to terms with it, I think the generation which felt the war and the genocide on its own skin was not successful in coming to terms with what happened to them. Because let's remember, these were people who lived a let's say, relatively good life before the war, who never believed that their neighbors would become the main perpetrators of crimes. And these are people whose lives changed in a matter of a few years. They are highly traumatized. So the further they are from Bosnia, the more traumatized they are. People who live in Bosnia during the whole last 25 years, I think they through some interconnections, regional, local, and so on, they have been forced to work and cooperate and to very quickly come to terms with what happened. But those who were forced out in a very brutal way in 1992, summer of 92, and have been back to Bosnia 2 or 3 times till now, I think that they are much more traumatized than here. So the other thing is that, on the other hand, nobody has asked for forgiveness for victims in these local communities. The only case of when Bosnian Serb authorities asked or apologized for what happened was in the 2004 Srebrenica Commission, which published its report, and then the Bosnian Serb government apologized for what happened in Srebrenica. And this is the report which has been annulled by Milorad Dodik last year. So basically, we have a huge issue of the perpetrators itself not coming to terms with what they did, but rather also the celebration of the crimes committed. In the sense that most of the perpetrators and communities to which they belong to celebrate people who have been coming back from Hague Tribunal or from the local court in Sarajevo after serving their lifelong sentence. They're coming back to their hometowns to our heroes' welcome. So this is a huge issue which actually the international community and the local governments here in Bosnia have not been addressing.
Those are all really, really good points that you make. Bosnia and the Bosnian genocide, it is particularly unique when we sort of take into consideration the way there was a complete lack of reconciliation within the country by the governments, by the international community. When we take a look at Rwanda, there's been a sort of ongoing attempt at reconciliation. There has been asking for forgiveness and accepting the forgiveness. None of that has really happened in Bosnia ever. There are no cases of that. And even when we look at the Holocaust, Germany did admit the guilt. They admitted guilt. They have since continued to make this a part of their history and address it in a way that this is a negative part, this should not be glorified, we should learn the lessons of it. So I do think in many ways that Bosnia is particularly unique in that none of that has happened there. And it makes it really difficult for that reconciliation to happen. And I'm glad you said that. I'm glad I asked the question of, do you think there's going to be a possibility of returnees? I don't think there will be either. And I've always been sort of hopeful that eventually we will get to that point where the people who are traumatized will come to terms with their trauma, come home and sort of heal and grow from that. Unfortunately, I think for that to happen, we really do need that first step to be taken. And that first step really is a collective recognition of the genocide by Republika Srpska and the Serbian government as well. Now, I did want to ask, going from that, obviously detention camps were one huge part of the Bosnian genocide. And they had their huge role to play in it. It was a source of dehumanization. It was a source of trauma. It was a source of fear-mongering in a way, and ensuring that these people really are too afraid to ever come back to their home, and really too afraid to sort of stage an uprising or rebel against the occupying force in a way. But the other part of the genocide that is often, I think, not spoken about enough is the sheer amount of concealment of the crimes. We now know that there's been a huge consistent efforts of propaganda at erasing the truth of what happened. But even at the time, the Serbian forces were completely aware that what they were doing was going to come back to basically um, be charged as, you know, ethnic cleansing, as genocide. And one of their key strategies was really the mass graves. Now, I wanted to sort of take a look at your perception, and if in your research as a genocide scholar, you've sort of taken a look at the mass graves of Bosnia and at the concealment of those mass graves as well, and how that sort of affected the population, and the fact that I know even this past weekend, actually, we just located a new mass graves, I believe, in the Knezovo region.
Kotovarosh,
Kotovarosh, yes, that's it. Yeah, so yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, what you could see from the case of the detention centers, the concentration camps, and the mass graves is that there was a pattern of perpetrators, a very unique, unified pattern throughout the whole region, which was under control of us and forces. So, I mean, how do we prove this? By showing that it was basically impossible at the time to set up camps by the same forces, by the same perpetrators, and to do the same exact things on a vast territory from Prijedor to Bilića. The same things were happening at the same time. So obviously there was some sort of order and coordination between these local authorities from the Bosnian Serb Republic government up down to the local work through an interconnected series of agencies and organs which were directed with and by the Serb Democratic Party. So the Serb Democratic Party and their local population, their local officials were the ones who implemented the genocidal plan in Bosnia. The way how they did this was they had their 6 strategic goals from 12th of May 1992, which they basically implemented in their local territories. Of course, now, since the local perpetrator, since these crimes were really localized, in the sense that I don't think that Karcic knew who was going to be executed in Omarska on a certain day. He didn't even need to know. What he was interested in was getting rid of the Bosniak population from Prijedor and from the river. But the local crisis committees, which were set up in each and every municipality, basically each and every municipality was organizing their local crimes in their own municipality in coordination with the regional committees of the Serb Democratic Party. They were the ones who set up the police force, the local army later, and so on. So they were all acting in the same unified, synchronized way. And the 2 main ways you can prove this is through the mass graves and through the concentration camps. Of course, you had a series of other things such as the destruction of religious buildings, these sporadic massacres of people in villages, and so on. The camps were definitely used as a filter and as a way to traumatize. Now, when we talk about mass graves, the way how these mass graves were made, they were I mean, they basically had this large specter of different areas where they were dumped bodies of the killed. So they were either using natural areas, for example, caves, rivers, and so on. These were the most easiest places to dump the bodies. For example, the Drina River is the largest mass grave in definitely in Europe. Last 2 years, basically, and that's where several thousand people were dumped in 1992 from Foča, Tepa, Visegrad, Srebrenica, and so on, and for the entire time of the war from 1992 to 1995. In other cases, you have a much more sophisticated way of burying and concealing the crimes. And this was by setting up the primary, secondary, tertiary mass graves. What this basically means is that the Bosnian Serb forces would dig up a huge mass grave, dump the bodies of people in the grave, return there after a year or so, remove the bodies to several other locations. So, for example, the mass grave in Tomashta was removed to several other locations, and thus you have the bodies. In similar case, and most famous case, of course, is Srebrenica, but those weren't the only examples. The removal of bodies was a way in which they wanted to conceal the crimes committed, especially after they realized that American spy planes were taking aerial photographs of the area where they were burying the mass graves. So by removing these bodies from one mass grave to another, what really happened in reality was that the body of one victim was scattered and cut up into a dozen different locations throughout eastern and northwestern Bosnia, throughout the whole territory of Bosnia. So basically, this new method of concealing a crime, and this is something which is basically the invention of the Bosnian Civil Army. Nowhere in the past have mass graves been removed in such a professional manner and in such a method of concealing a crime committed. The most important thing they did was in Srebrenica after this in 1995, and that's where the most of the mass graves were removed in such a professional manner. But again, this wasn't the only case. You had the same situation in Visegrad, in Rogatica, in northwestern Bosnia, and so on and so forth. And then in some cases, they would remove the body kilometers away from the execution sites. For example, a group of people who were killed in Sarajevo were driven up to Romania Mountain and buried there, which is some 50 kilometers away. So they were trying to get rid of the bodies as far away as possible. And of course, you have the case of the Drina River, which I mentioned earlier. At one point of time in summer of 1992, the number of bodies which were dumped into the Drina River was so large that the director of the Bajina Bašta hydroelectric dam in Serbia called the Visegrad authorities and told them to slow down the killings because the bodies were creating a problem for his hydroelectric dam in Bajina Bašta. This is something which Ed Voliami recorded in one of his stories from 1992. So you have this large number of evidence showing that this kind of concealment of crimes and mass atrocities was something very specific for the Bosnian genocide itself, the removal of bodies. And this removal of bodies, according to some informants, lasted up to 2003, 2004, because most of the perpetrators who committed these crimes, they concealed the bodies so that they wouldn't be arrested. So you have this removal of bodies going on for a long number of years after Dayton Peace Accords were.
Now, taking into consideration the way those mass graves played out, and as you mentioned, even as late as 2003, 2004, there was still an ongoing attempt at concealment of the mass graves. So basically, if they dug a mass grave in 93, they would dig it up sometime in 98, 99, and move it to another place. That way those bodies would not be able to be found. And one thing for our viewers is that this is part of the ongoing genocide denial that's really, really prevented that sort of progress from happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because it's quite difficult for people to feel at peace when they're not even able to bury their loved ones, when they're still looking for their mass remains. And then to take into consideration that there are people, their neighbors, their co-workers, who maybe possibly know about the location of these mass graves and the remains, and they're not speaking up. They're further concealing them. They're sort of carrying on this legacy of genocide denial. One thing that I've said in a lot of my prior lectures and interviews is, for me, the Bosnian genocide has always felt as an ongoing project. And really, when we take a look at genocide in general and sort of study it in detail, we can sort of look at the fact that it really is ongoing. And genocide denial, obviously, is a huge part of that. It's ensuring that the trauma of the genocide continues. given everything that we know about Bosnia and about the genocide denial, what do you think is our best approach at combating this? For me, obviously, it's sharing survivor stories, but I do want to hear your perspective of it as a genocide scholar.
Well, you see, I mean, like 15 years ago, genocide denial of the Bosnian genocide was the corners of some blogs and websites throughout, Serbian diaspora websites, such as Gana.com, Empress Clothes, these leftist websites, and so on. Today, 15 years later on, the genocide denial has become much more sophisticated in the sense that now we have state institutions which are funding research projects, reenactments of massacre sites and things like that. I'm talking about Serbia proper, people who are funding these things, but also Serb Republic in Bosnia. Second thing, this genocide denial has come into the pores of different, of certain Western economic and political circles, which is much more frustrating because in the cases such as Peter Handke and Jessica Stern, we can see that these conspiracy theories, which we really found quite, ridiculous 15 years ago, such as that the Bosnian government bombarded itself in the Markale case and so on. These are things which we totally ignored 15 years ago because this was irrelevant online trolls. They have become part of some mainstream academic discourse. And what makes it more worse is that these are books that are being published by some really good academic publishers. So it's quite fascinating how this rhetoric has been has managed to enter these different segments of life in the West. And the fact that Peter Handke was able to get a prize even after the huge campaign which was rallied against him shows actually that certain parts of specifically in that case, not only silent and mute to victims' feelings, but also in some sense quite Islamophobic and anti-Bosnian to that extent. Now, the only way that we can fight against this kind of denial is through writing our own narrative, and this is something which we have to be really self-critical of. 25 years after the war ended, we do not have a single book written by a Bosnian about the Bosnian War. We have 3 books written by Srebrenica survivors, in English language. You have dozens of things written in Bosnian and published all over the world, but when we talk about getting serious Western academic publishers, we can narrow it down to 3 or 4 books. And people have usually narrowed down some of their research to very specific, small, localized topics, but never went outside of the borders and to attend conference to talk about the crimes committed here and so on. So basically, our narrative about the war, the last 25 years, has been written by foreigners. Most of them have been really good, have been fantastic. Some of them have been quite bad, and cases like Jessica Stern have shown that in some cases, some of these academics really don't care. I mean, their aim is to get a book out, don't care about what is written inside. So these kind of books actually fuel the genocide denial machinery throughout the world, and you can see that her book has been really used by the Serbian diaspora from Australia to the U.S. Saying that, look, we have a person who's saying that the Bosnian army sniper fired their own civilians in order to get the sympathy of the West. So the best way to deal with genocide denial and to combat genocide denial is by writing our own stories, telling our own stories, writing our own narrative about the war, taking part in discourses and different international conferences and so on. But also, to some extent, we need to draw a red line and define, what is the red line which we do not cross. For example, you have some certain, since genocide recognition and commemoration is somehow interconnected with politics, you have cases where, for example, the Serbian parliament passed a resolution several years ago where they commemorated Srebrenica without mentioning the G word. This was, pushed by certain governments, and this was called a huge, step forward and so on. We definitely need to we as Bosniaks, we need to find what is the red line which we should not cross. I mean, if somebody recognizes Srebrenica without mentioning genocide, then they basically did not recognize Srebrenica as a genocide. Secondly, we have accepted, for example, the European Parliament resolution from 2009 as a great resolution, even though it is really watered down. Read it. I mean, when you compare the European Parliament resolution to the American resolution, Congress resolution from 2005 and so on, then you can see actually the huge difference between the American resolution recognition and the European Parliament resolution. Because the U.S. resolution does not narrow itself down on Srebrenica itself. It's much more tougher, harder, and uses a much more stronger language. Whereas the European Parliament resolution narrows itself down only on Srebrenica, and is focused more on other things than on the recognition of victims itself. So these are some of the things which we as a people need to decide on. What is our what is our end goal? What is our aim? How do we commemorate the genocide, in which way, and so on? And we shouldn't be happy to accept each and every kind of recognition. It's better not to have any kind of recognition than to have a very watered down one. Because once you get some of these European bureaucrats used to certain watered down opinions, then they are always going to keep a hand on it. But nevertheless, the most important part right now is for people, especially those who are living in the diaspora, who know foreign languages very well, who are studying, who are well educated and so on. They should be focusing more on the Bosnian War itself, covering different aspects of the war, covering different aspects of genocide, writing more about it, attending international conferences, basically just to have their voices heard. Because you have certain cases where at international conferences there's a panel on Bosnia and there's not a single Bosnian there.
Yeah.
Not because nobody invited you, but because there's nobody there to talk. And somebody who knows the basic things about who is able to write an academic article about an aspect of Bosnian genocide. So we are also in some way, the academic community here in Bosnia is in some way, limited and narrowed down to Bosnia itself and to the region, due to language barriers, due to some sort of comfort, not leaving their comfort zone and so on. So this is something which the Bosnian diaspora has a very good chance of expanding their whole, and expanding their knowledge to this extent, and to talk and to tell the stories which their parents were not able to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And one thing that I've been really immensely sort of happy to see is that the generation below me, so the younger generation, is really, as they're going into school, I'm sort of seeing that a lot of them are going into genocide studies, are going into sociology, which is quite a change for us, I think, collectively. So I am hopeful that that will at least make some sort of an impact for us in the long term, and hopefully more of us can go out and get our masters and get our PhDs and focus in on the academic writing, because I do agree with you, Hikmet, that our stories are really, really important, but the academic overview on Bosnia and the Bosnian genocide has really been completely overtaken by Western perspectives. We're often told that we are not objective enough, which is obviously a huge problem, because one can be a survivor and a genocide scholar at the same time and have the same sort of objectivity. So I do hope that your statements encourage our young people, especially in the diaspora, to go out and to really get more knowledgeable. Because I do, from my perspective, it's not enough that we are just survivors of the genocide. We also have to be educated on what happened, not just in our cities or our villages, but everywhere. Because that combating genocide denial really takes an extensive amount of education. We want to make sure that we're saying the right things and that we're countering the arguments with the truth, with facts, with validity. So again, pick up those books and get to work, hopefully.
And also, there's another thing. When you compare, to other genocides, you'll see that Jewish survivors actually second generation was the generation which really started to research more and more about the Holocaust. Talking about the Holocaust really started more in the late 70s, basically, than before. So I think we are also, as a people, we're going through this whole experience and change. We cannot expect from our older generations, scholars who lived through the war to be writing about these things. It's up to us, the younger generation, to write things, and especially these kids in the West, in the diaspora, who have that opportunity to get a good education, to have access to different archives and journals and so on and so forth. They're the ones who should be writing their own stories, basically, because in the end, this is a war for narrative. If you don't write your own story, somebody else, the perpetrator, will be writing their own story. So today you have several books which are written on Markale Marketplace, massacre and the Papia massacre in Serbia, which are basically trying to show, these are things which are funded by the Serbian government, to show that the Bosnian government bombarded itself in 1994 and 1995 in order to get sympathy from the West. Whereas you don't have many books written about, the massacres from victims. To have the court judgment, which, thank God that we have the judgments there. That's where the Hague Tribunal comes in with their amazing workload and evidence provided and so on. But nevertheless, even with all the huge evidence which was used, and it's really high level of evidence which was used at the Hague Tribunal, we still have genocide deniers.
Yeah.
Imagine what we're up against. Imagine if we did not have the ICTY, we did not have the court, then the denial would be unbeatable, much higher than today.
Yeah, and the Bosnian genocide is one of the most well documented and forensically evident cases of genocide. So, and obviously Holocaust deniers still exist to this day. So it's naturally that we're gonna see that with the Bosnian genocide as well. And it's unfortunate, and we just have to continue to combat it each and every way we know how. I did want us to touch on one particular topic that is quite close to me. The Visegrad region saw a really horrific genocidal ethnic cleansing campaign that started in 1992. It's estimated that throughout the Bosnian War, between 1,000 to 3,000 people in the very small town of Visegrad were murdered. And as you mentioned, Drina is known as the largest mass grave in Bosnia. Now, there are two particular horrific events in Visegrad that occurred, and the anniversary of them is coming up. One is the Pionirska fire, which I believe happened on June 14th, 1992, and then the Bikovac fire, which happened on June 27th, 1992. I wanted to have you sort of walk us through that and give our viewers a little more explanation about that.
Yeah, so I mean, when you look from a statistical point of view, you would, an outsider would say that the number of people killed in Visegrad was low, 3,000 people in one place. It's statistically, compared to other genocides, quite low. But if you look from a very local perspective, when you compare the number of the whole overview of the population of Visegrad, the number of people who were there at that time when crimes were committed, this is a really large number of killed. And mostly these were people who were from different parts of the city itself. Visegrad is one of the most brutal areas where the genocidal campaign was by the Bosnian Serb forces. It was a border town very close to Serbia. It was one of the most strategic towns to be taken over by the Yugoslav People's Army. So the Yugoslav Army was the first one which occupied the town. Um, then the killing started very soon later on. So why is Visegrad specific? It's because some of the most brutal sadistic crimes and executions were committed in Visegrad. The Pionirska and the Bikovac fires were just two examples. Visegrad is infamous for the Mehmet Pasha Sokolovic Bridge, the Ottoman bridge in the river Drina, which was built by the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmet Pasha Sokolovic. And basically, this old Ottoman stone bridge was used as an execution site by the Serb forces in Second World War and in 1992. This is some sort of ritual executions of Muslims, Bosniak Muslims in Visegrad. There's another ideological thing which I just want to explain to the viewers, those of the viewers who don't know the context of Serb nationalist ideology, and that is that Slavic Muslims, Bosniaks, Slavic Muslims, are considered race traitors, people who converted to Islam 500 years ago when the Ottomans came, and thus they betrayed Christianity in that way. So we, as the descendants of these traitors, need to be punished here today in this world. So basically, this sort of Christ killer ideology of Serb nationalists is something which was used, which you can see not only in camps, but also in cases like Visegrad, where they were being brought to this old Ottoman bridge and ritually killed there, and their bodies thrown into the Drina River. So that's one thing. The other aspect of Visegrad is the rape camps. Visegrad is home to one of the most infamous rape camps during the war called Vila na Vlas, which was a spa hotel before the war. It was used as a rape camp in 1992, and today it is still used as a spa hotel. So you can go now to TripAdvisor, find Vila na Vlas, and book yourself a hotel room in the same room where somebody was raped 25 years ago. And by the way, this hotel is almost always full, with foreign tourists coming over and so on. A few years ago, a local British tour guide wrote in his actually recommended Vila na Vlas as a romantic spot for young couples to come and visit in Visegrad. He has later on taken this out from his guidebook after pressure, and there's even a film made about this case. It is called For Those Who Can Tell No Tales, made by Kim Verko and Jasmine Lezbanic. That was a few years ago. So basically, Visegrad has, and by the way, the genocide in Visegrad was most quick genocide that occurred in Bosnia. So by 15th of August, we did not have any more Bosniaks living in Visegrad. So the killing started in May, June, July, basically. In 3 months' time, 3,000 people were killed in Visegrad. And in some cases, on a daily basis, you had 100 people killed on the bridge. And these were, people from young kids, babies, to 99-year-olds. The two fires which occurred were the most specific crimes committed during the Bosnian genocide. We don't have many cases of people being burned alive, but in the case of Visegrad, we had two such cases which happened in basically 2 weeks' time. So on the 14th of June, the whole entire village of Koritnik was cleansed. The women and children were brought down to town. They were brought up to a house in Pionirska Street in Visegrad, robbed, raped, and sexually abused by Serb soldiers. And then the house was barricaded, the windows were shut, the doors were shut. The carpets inside the house were already, filled with gasoline. So this was a preempted crime. And then the house was set on fire, and almost 60 people were burnt alive. Um, Almost entirely women and children. There were no males inside, maybe a couple of older people, elderly there. They were all burnt alive, and a few people managed to survive by um, you know, breaking through one of the windows and jumping out from the window. And on the side of the house, there were several soldiers who were standing, waiting for the people to start jumping out, and they were shooting at the people who were jumping out. But nevertheless, a few people managed to survive, seriously wounded and so on. And later on, they were witnesses. You know, 2 weeks later on the 27th of June, on the eve of St. Vincent's Day of Vidovdan, on the 28th of June, the same case happened. The Serb forces came up to Hikmet neighborhood in Visegrad. They gathered women and children who were there, who were basically refugees from other villages surrounding Visegrad, who were trying to seek refuge in that small area. They barricaded them inside the house and they set it on fire. And from this house, only one woman survived. So basically, the perpetrators learned from their mistakes 15 days earlier, in which several people managed to survive. And they sophisticated their method of burning people alive 15 days later on. So in this case, only one woman, Zahra Karcic, she managed to escape from the house, severely burned. She was in really bad shape, to that extent that she went up the next day to a local soldier and begged him to kill her. She couldn't take the pain anymore. He helped her, brought her to a local house where she was taken care of by several elderly women who were hiding inside the house. And then later on, she managed to escape to territory which was controlled by Bosnian government forces. And later on, she was a witness at the Hague Tribunal. But let's get back to the idea of collective trauma. Zahra Turyachnin, as the sole witness of the crime, never returned back to Visegrad or wanted to. Even another thing it's very specific for her is that she gave her testimony in French. So she learned French. She doesn't want to speak Bosnian anymore. She doesn't want to have anything to do with Bosnia. And for a long time, she was protected witness for the Hague Tribunal, so you couldn't see her identity and her face. But after Milan Lukic, the main perpetrator who committed both of these crimes, after he was arrested in Argentina, similar to Nazis who were running away to South America, Bosnian Serb perpetrators were also doing the same, going to America. Milan Lukic was arrested in Argentina, and he was brought to the Hague Tribunal to be tried for his crimes. Once he was arrested, she asked that she wanted to testify against him without any protective measures. Why? Because she knew Milan Lukic from high school. So she wanted to testify against him, and she wanted him to see her testifying against her. So this was the first time that she actually publicly came out, and that people saw her true identity. So she's like one of the examples of this collective trauma. People who totally survived the trauma from the war and who have never returned back to Bosnia for many reasons. Totally acceptable and understandable.
Yeah.
So these are Visegrad is definitely one of the worst places in Bosnia, and one of the worst places where the crimes were committed in Bosnia. And the fact that the largest number of women killed in Bosnia was in Visegrad.
Yeah.
The largest number of children killed in Bosnia during the war was in Visegrad and in Nevesinje. So these two towns. I'm talking percentage-wise. Compare the number of people killed in accordance to the population census in 1991. But let's slowly put aside the war. After the war in Visegrad, we had a large campaign, which still lasts to this day, of rewriting the history, in which the local monument, the victim monument for victims of genocide, was erased by the local authorities. So there was a monument put up a memorial put up in 2012, which read to all the victims of the Visegrad genocide. and the word genocide was erased by the local Serb authorities. So they didn't have a problem with the memorial itself; they had a problem with the word memorial. So they brought in, 100 members of the special police, and the man came, worker came with a grinder, and they erased the word genocide from the memorial. Not only that, but also the Serbian filmmaker Emir Kusturica, who is very famous in certain Western circles, leftist underground films and so on. He is basically, with the help of Serbian government, of Bosnian Serb government, and of Russian government, creating a new artificial town in Visegrad called Andrićgrad, or Andrić town. This town is basically built there according to Ivo Andrić's book, The Bridge over the River Drina, which got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1960s. And he actually wants to create a town which would look like if there were no elements of Ottoman history. So then we're going back again to the ethno-religious segment of the genocide, in which now, so after you got rid of all the entire Muslim population from the town, you got rid of the mosques, of the people, of the graves, and so on. Now they are building a new town, and they built it already, which is filled of, Roman, Greek architecture, Orthodox Christian symbolism, and so on, throughout the whole entire. So this is basically called. There was a good title of it, I think, in the Guardian. Called it the Disneyland of Serb nationalism. The town. So this is also an example of how this is a very sophisticated cultural genocide which is being committed in Visegrad itself. Yeah, Visegrad is definitely one of the most brutal examples of genocide in Eastern Bosnia in 1990. These crimes were committed and they were completed by August 1992.
Yeah, and thank you for that very detailed explanation. I think it's really, really important that we shine a focus on these crimes and really get the sort of total picture of the brutality of Serbian forces and the sort of ongoing attempts to erase the suffering that people have experienced and cover up the crimes and rewrite history and engage in historical revisionism. It's a sort of ongoing battle for Bosniaks of all sorts, but also, I think, especially for Bosniak academics and activists. It really is something that we have been trying our hardest to fight against. So I do think that discussing these issues and sort of putting them out there really helps counter those narratives that have been sort of ongoing. One thing that I wanted to sort of ask you about, I have my own criticism of the ICTY. Now, given everything that we know about Prijedor, about Visegrad, about Foča, and Srebrenica, do you think, in your sort of academic opinion, do you think that what constituted genocide in Bosnia, do you think that what happened in Bosnia overall constituted genocide and that it shouldn't have been declared as a sort of localized genocide?
Look, I mean, we shouldn't get into the trap of judicial fact. So the ICTY based its findings on the evidence and arguments provided by the prosecution. So the prosecution was the one which came up with the arguments, with the evidence which they managed to gather in 98, 99, 2000, and so on. And they made a case for certain cases. So in some cases, like in Biljana Plavšić, they wanted to drop off the genocide charge in order to get at least something for her, just to get rid of her in some way. So I'm a person who doesn't really stick entirely to the findings of the ICTY, because I think that we have the judicial truth is one thing, the historical truth is another. There are certain things which the crimes which were committed in areas like in Visegrad and so on, they have no paper trail. So it's impossible to prove that somebody ordered some units of the Bosnian Serb army or police There's no order saying let's burn 70 people alive on Nikolaus.
Mm-hmm.
No order. There's nothing. There's no paper trail. But we have one witness, Zahra Toriachini, who survived it. Now imagine if Zahra did not survive. Would we be able to prove Nikolaus?
Yeah.
So just because, imagine if Zahra wasn't alive and if the ICTY did not prove that Nikolaus existed or happened, does that mean that because it did not occur? Of course not. So basically, the ICTY is there to provide the aim of the ICTY, the aim of courts, not to write history, but it's there to prosecute war criminals based on the evidence provided to the prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
The work of the historians is to write the history.
Yeah.
So each and every historian needs to write history. We can argue and agree or disagree with what each one of us writes, but the role of the ICTY and the role of courts is not there to write history. That's the main important fact. The problem is that many members of the Boston academia narrowed their findings down, and they took a much more easier path of just rewriting judgments and verdicts which were brought by the ICTY.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to go through the whole entire documentation provided by the ICTY. If you go to the legal library of the ICTY, you'll find there hundreds of thousands of documents, minutes of the Boston Assembly, of decisions of the crisis committees, things which were not even used by a person.
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't have enough time. They didn't, they didn't, those things which they had did not prove, or did not matter to them at that time and so on. But it's really hard to take all of this material evidence, which was there, documentation, go through it, read it, analyze it, and so on. So people usually take the easier way out by just rewriting those things which are already written in the judgments itself. And this is a big mistake, of course, because we need to use evidence, which was, and this is one of the best things which happened. The ICTY has this huge load of evidence and materials which were used by the perpetrators, by the army, by the police, by the local governments, by the ministries, and so on. And these are all there waiting to be analyzed and written. And so you already have people who are starting to use these archives and writing it. Mostly it's foreign historians. Again, not locals to that extent. So if we use certain ways of, certain logic and reasoning and so on, what I would say is that you can definitely prove genocidal intent in Bosnia in 1992 to 1995, especially, and this is something which I definitely stand behind, the genocide was committed in the Drina Valley and in the Sana River Valley. So these two areas, and which were highly populated by Bosniak Muslims, they were the most targeted areas of the war, and these are where the most of the crimes were committed. The other segment is that the Bosnians themselves organized some sort of resistance to the Bosnian army. Mm-hmm. This wasn't a very good resistance, it wasn't a very successful resistance, but this was a resistance which managed to physically stop the Bosniaks from being totally eliminated from these areas. Yeah. Now, maybe if there wasn't a Bosnian army, maybe if everybody here was killed, it would be easier to prove genocidal. But that did not happen. So now we have people who survive, but we have areas such as the Drina River and the Sana area where these entire communities were totally eliminated from here, and it will be for ages. So overall, looking, firstly, there's a language thing. I don't see a reason why not to use the word Bosnian genocide. Because nobody says Kigali genocide. Everybody says Rwanda genocide. So why would we focus only on Srebrenica? Even if we do that, the people who were killed in Srebrenica were not only from Srebrenica. They were from 15 different municipalities in the whole of Eastern Bosnia. I think that the number of people from Bratunac were more killed in the Srebrenica genocide than people from Srebrenica itself. Yeah. So Srebrenica was basically a small open air camp of Bosniaks from the whole entire ethnically cleansed area in eastern Bosnia who came down to Srebrenica and who were killed there in 1995. The Bosnian Serb perpetrators in July 1995 did not say, who's from Srebrenica, we want to kill them. They weren't killed because they were from Srebrenica, but rather they were killed because they were Bosniak Muslims. So the perpetrator themselves did not care about who was from where. So that's the term Bosnian genocide is totally justified to be used, and we usually use in the ICTY use the directive number 7 as the genocidal intent for the Muslims of Eastern Bosnia and of Srebrenica. But the directive number 7 of the Bosnian Serb Army is very closely related, and it's actually part of the chain of evidence which leads up to the six strategic goals of the Serbian people from May 12, 1992. So there's a connection between 1992 and 1995. Srebrenica could have fallen in 1993. It could have fallen in 1994. The war could have lasted even longer. But the fact of the matter is, the Bosnian Serb establishment wanted to definitely get rid of the enclaves and the Muslim population from the Drina Valley and from Krajina. That's why the Bosnian Serb army focused on Bihać, on Srebrenica, Žepa, and Gorazde. So these were definitely the most important targets of the Bosnian Serb establishment, not only to defeat there militarily, but also to physically destroy anyone from coming back. So yeah, definitely that's why I always use the term Bosnian genocide. I don't see a problem with it. And people have usually told me that you can't use the term Bosnian genocide because there's no judgment and there's no verdict and so on and so forth. I honestly don't see that as a valuable argument because since when is everybody such a legalist today? That's one thing. Second thing is that we have so many genocides which occurred in the world today which do not have any court judgments. So Darfur genocide, we all use it. We use the term. The ISIS genocide on the Yazidis and the other minorities there's no court judgments and so on. So this argument is used by some people who want to downplay and minimize what happened in Bosnia by making some sort of equation of responsibility and crimes committed here. People who want to show that what actually happened here was some sort of tribal warfare and civil war which occurred in Bosnia, where you have all this ethnic hatred where everybody's killing everybody for years to come in. So that's why I actually don't use the term. That's why I actually use the term Bosnian genocide always. This is something which somebody from Sarajevo ended up in Srebrenica in July 1995. He would have also been killed for the same reasons any other man who was there, who was from Srebrenica, from the region at that time.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree. I think I always sort of approach it with the perspective of legal rulings are one thing, and obviously they can be very beneficial. The collected evidence that we have by the ICTY is immensely beneficial in just doing the genocide research and scholarly work that we need to do. But there is always a difference between historical narratives, the historical truth, scholarly definitions. I mean, just the sociological definition. My master's was sociology with really an emphasis on genocide studies. So I'm approaching it from the perspective of a sociologist. And from that perspective, it's really quite easy to see that everything that happened in Bosnia was really genocidal. It had the intent and it had the end result of genocide. And really looking at the 10 stages of genocide, it completely fits in every single aspect from beginning to end. So yeah, I absolutely agree, and thank you so much for that amazing explanation. I think it's really important that when we discuss Srebrenica, when we discuss Bosnia, we really do tell the whole truth and we don't minimize it. in any sort of way. I think that's the best way that we can continue countering these narratives. Now, I do have one final question for Dr. Karcic, who has been a wonderful guest and has given us so much amazing information that I think will be really valuable to everybody. My final question is more of your own personal opinion. Why do you think it's important for us to commemorate the Bosnian genocide?
Well, I mean, there are several reasons. Firstly, we shouldn't be very Boston-centric. We shouldn't believe that everybody. This is something which I hear very often from people in Boston. Everybody says here that the whole entire world knows what happened in Bosnia. That's something which I often hear from people here. And second thing is that people minimize the work of denialists by saying we have all the court judgments and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I mean, Bosnia is not in the center of people's attention anymore. Secondly, nobody, every news has a certain time span, and the time span for people being interested in Bosnia has faded away a long time ago. There are new conflict zones and new genocides focusing on right now. Why should we remember the Bosnian genocide? Because firstly, we need to remember it for the people who are not here anymore. People who or for people who are still buried and who are located in some hidden mass graves in the forest of Bosnia. We need to remember it for those people. Secondly, we need to remember them for the people who deny that these victims ever existed. Huge army of denialists and trolls on social media who totally, celebrate what happened. I think this is something which our non-Bosnian viewers need to be aware of, is that the Bosnian genocide gave wings to certain right-wing groups in the world to commit crime. For the first time since the end of the Holocaust, in Bosnia in 1992 to 1995, you had neo-Nazis, you had right-wing groups came here to fight for the Bosnian Serb army, and also who fought for the Croatian Defense Forces. Certain people from these groups went back to their nation states and continued practicing their right-wing ideas. One specific case, something which I wrote about a few years ago, was the Greek Volunteer Guard, a group of around 100 Greek citizens who took part in the Srebrenica genocide in July 1995, who also took part in certain other crimes in 1994 and 1993. They took part in the Srebrenica genocide. They came back to Greece, and now they make up the core of the Golden Dawn neo-Nazi political party in Greece. So basically, what I want to say is that since many people have ignored the consequences of the Bosnian genocide, what certain people are now realizing in the West is that the problem, the Bosnian genocide, isn't only a problem for Bosniaks themselves, but now it's becoming a much more global problem itself. So the deterrent case in New Zealand, the Christchurch massacre, Breivik massacre in Norway, and so on, actually proves that the Bosnian genocide has become an inspiration for right-wing movements and neo-Nazis throughout the world, which getting rid of Slavic Muslims in the 1990s was a sort of inspiration in order to get rid of any minority anywhere. You will see this happening all over the globe. You'll see Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic, Bosnian Serb leaders, celebrated not only as Serbian heroes, but as some anti-Muslim, anti-minority, whatever symbol there. And you can see this through the social media aspect, in which channels like 4chan and so on, they use this Serbian nationalist music, Serbia Strong, and Karcic Lead Your Army song as a sort of national anthem for these right-wing groups. So in order to combat these right-wing groups and these neo-Nazis and so on, we must work together in order to commemorate the victims of Bosnian genocide, to show that these right-wing groups must not have a say, must not commemorate these perpetrators in such a way. It is totally unacceptable for Serbian nationalist singers to be going today in Western Europe and in Australia to give, tours all over the country to the diaspora there to sing about, killing Muslims in Bosnia and so on and so forth. And this is something which is happening very often. The Chetnik organizations in Australia and in the US operate very freely, just like they operate in Serbia and in Bosnia. And this is something which definitely needs to be monitored by the security agencies in the West. What are their connections with the right-wing groups? Some of these organizations have been harboring perpetrators and sending support money to protect war criminals in Bosnia and in Serbia and so on. So in order to stop these right-wing groups from operating freely, from creating more trouble, from committing more massacres throughout the world, we need to commemorate Bosnia even more. We need to commemorate the Bosnian genocide. We need to we need to actually to make a case out of the Bosnian genocide, to say stop to ethnic hatred, to say stop to racism, to say stop to any sort of genocide denial anywhere in the world. So basically, just like the Bosnian genocide is an inspiration for right-wing groups, the Bosnian genocide needs to be an inspiration for human rights activists throughout the world to battle hate crimes, to battle hate speech, battle genocide denial anywhere in the world.
That's a really well put statement, and again, I completely agree with you. We do have our work cut out for us, but as we continue having these sort of discussions, as we continue hopefully publishing even more scholarship on the Bosnian genocide, survivor stories, books, videos, all of these things, I hope that they will contribute to the legacy of truth and to countering the historical revisionism and genocide denialism that we're continuing to see. I do hope that with that, as we sort of continue to commemorate, I do hope our viewers and our followers will continue to tune in to these discussions. Most importantly, this year marks 25 years of since the Bosnian genocide in Srebrenica. So this year on July 11th at 7 p.m., the UK National Commemoration will be hosted virtually. So it will be actually accessible for all of our viewers and followers. And we hope that you will tune in and help us preserve the truth and push against the genocide denial by allowing the survivors of the genocide a platform to speak on the horrors that they endured, so that we really do not forget, and so that we can actually get to the point where never again really does mean never again. Thank you, Dr. Karcic, for this wonderful discussion. It's been extremely enlightening for me, and I'm sure for so many of our viewers and our followers. And I hope that they all got something out of it, which I'm sure that they did, as it's always quite nice to directly hear from actual scholars and experts on the genocide. So again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, and thanks for all the work that Remembering Srebrenica is doing. Keep the memory alive of Srebrenica in the UK.
Thank you so much, and thank you, viewers. We hope to see you soon.